Welcome to Wild Cowboy Tales, the dustiest corner of the internet where legends of the Old West are resurrected, gunslingers find their redemption or their doom, and the horizon is always stained with the promise of blood or gold. We spin yarns of grit, betrayal, and vengeance under the unforgiving sun. If you've got a taste for whiskey-soaked tales and the smell of gunpowder on the wind, you're in the right place. Before we ride into today's story of a promise forged in dust and sealed in blood, make sure you pull that subscribe button from its holster and ring that notification bell like you're sounding the alarm. You don't want to miss a single shot. The air in the town of Redemption was thin and cold, carrying the scent of pine from the high country and something else of metallic tang of anticipation. It was the kind of morning that promised a clean slate, but the gallows standing stark against the pale, bruised sky told a different story. For two men in the town jail, it was the end of the line. Jedediah Jed Stone traced a crack in the stone floor with the toe of his worn boot. The cell was a cramped, foul-smelling box, but it was the sounds from outside that truly caged him. The murmur of a gathering crowd, the sharp, authoritative barks of Marshal Thorne organizing his deputies, the hollow thud of the hangman testing the trapdoor. Each sound was a nail being hammered into his friend's coffin. Beside him, Leo was unnervingly still. He sat on the edge of the cot, his hands resting on his knees, not cuffed. They hadn't bothered. Where was he going to run? Leo's face, usually a canvas of easy grins and reckless charm, was pale and drawn. But his eyes, when they met Jed's, still held a flicker of the fire that had led them down this god-forsaken path. "It's a fine morning for a hanging," Leo said, his voice a dry rasp. "Sky's clear. They'll all get a good view." Jed didn't answer. His own body was a map of their failed bank job in Silver Creek. A deputy's bullet had torn through his shoulder, and the beating they'd received upon capture had left his ribs screaming with every breath. But the physical pain was a dull hum beneath the roaring agony in his soul. They had been set up. The tip about the bank's light security, the timing of the patrol, the way Marshal Thorne's posse had been waiting just outside of town, it was all too perfect. And the man who had given them the tip, a slippery gambler named Silas Croft, was likely counting his reward money at that very moment. "You remember that time in the Cimarron territory?" Leo asked, a faint smile touching his lips. "When we were pinned down by the Comanches, and you swore if we got out, you'd buy a chicken farm." Jed grunted, a flicker of memory cutting through the gloom. "You were the one who wanted the damn chickens. Said they were less trouble than people." "Still true," Leo mused. He looked at his hands. "They never found the money, Jed. What we stashed from the Carson City job. It's still there, in the hollow oak by the river bend." "It's your money, Leo," Jed said, his voice thick. "It's our money. Always was." Leo finally stood up, stretching as if waking from a long sleep. "You get out of this, Jed. You take that money and you ride so far south the snow don't know your name. You buy that chicken farm. You hear me?" Before Jed could answer, the heavy bolt on the cell door scraped open. Marshal Thorne stood there, a tall, imposing figure with a face like chiseled granite and eyes that held no warmth. He was flanked by two deputies, their hands resting on their holstered pistols. "Time, Leo," the marshal said, his voice flat. Leo nodded. He turned to Jed, and for a moment, the swaggering outlaw was gone, replaced by the boy Jed had grown up with, the orphan who'd had his back in 100 dusty brawls. He clapped a hand on Jed's good shoulder. "Don't let them see you break," Leo whispered, his voice urgent. "Don't give them that satisfaction." He turned and walked out of the cell without a backward glance, his boots echoing on the stone floor. Jed lunged for the bars, his fingers gripping the cold iron as he watched them lead his friend away. "Leo." Leo paused but didn't turn. He just raised a hand in a final, silent farewell. They dragged Jed from his cell and chained him to a post in the center of the town square, forcing him to watch. The whole of Redemption was there. Men in dusty hats, women in their Sunday best clutching their children's hands, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and righteous satisfaction. He saw Silas Croft among them, standing near the saloon, a smug look on his face as he watched the proceedings. Jed's eyes locked onto him, and a cold, silent promise was made. They marched Leo up the 13 steps of the gallows. The preacher read a passage from the Bible, his words about damnation and salvation lost to the wind. Marshal Thorne read the sentence, his voice booming across the silent square, declaring Leo a thief and a murderer alike, as the bank guard had been killed by a stray bullet from a deputy's own rifle. The hangman, a burly, emotionless man, placed the black hood over Leo's head and cinched the noose around his neck. Even from a distance, Jed could see Leo's shoulders square. He wasn't struggling. He was facing it, just as he'd faced everything. Thorne gave the signal. The bolt was thrown, and the trapdoor fell away with a deafening crack. The crowd gasped. A woman screamed. Jed's world went silent. He saw nothing but the body of his friend, his only family, swinging at the end of a rope, silhouetted against the rising sun. A raw, guttural roar of pure anguish tore from his throat, a sound of an animal caught in a trap. He thrashed against his chains, the iron cutting into his wrists, but he felt nothing. He saw the faces in the crowd. The smug satisfaction of Silas Croft, the cold, impassive justice of Marshal Thorne, the jeering smiles of the deputies, the eager, hungry eyes of the townsfolk. They thought this was justice. They thought this was the end. As the sun cleared the horizon, bathing the gruesome scene in a clean, golden light, a new vow took root in the ashes of Jedediah Stone's soul. It was a vow colder than the jailhouse stone and harder than a coffin nail. Leo wanted him to run, to find peace. But there was no peace. Not anymore. He would not buy a chicken farm. He would not ride south. He would stay. He would turn their town of redemption into his own personal hell. He looked from the gallows to the faces in the crowd, memorizing each one. Before the sun set on this day, they would all know what real justice felt like. The debt would be paid. In blood. The sun, an indifferent god, began its slow, merciless climb into the sky. For Jedediah Stone, chained to the hitching post in the center of redemption, time had fractured. There was the blinding, searing present, and then there was the eternal, repeating moment of the drop, the snap of the rope, the grotesque final dance of the man he called brother. The image was burned onto the back of his eyes, a permanent afterimage against the glare of the day. The crowd, their morbid curiosity sated, began to drift away. They returned to their lives, their breakfasts, their morning chores, leaving the dead man to swing and the condemned man to bake. But some lingered. A group of boys, emboldened by their father's righteousness, took turns throwing pebbles that ticked off Jed's chest and forehead. He didn't flinch. A woman in a severe black dress, her face pinched with piety, paused to call him devil's spawn before pulling her own child away, as if his very presence might be a contagion. The town merchant, a portly man named Abernathy, spat a wad of tobacco juice into the dust near Jed's boots. Good riddance to bad rubbish, he declared to no one in particular. Jed registered it all. He was a vessel, filling slowly with their faces, their voices, their casual cruelty. Each pebble, each slur, each look of contempt was another name added to a list he was composing in the silent, screaming chambers of his mind. He saw Silas Croft, the architect of their downfall, retreat into the cool shadows of the grand saloon, his shoulders relaxed, a man without a care. He saw Marshal Thorne, wiping his hands on his trousers as if cleansing himself of the morning's dirty work, his posture radiating a smug, unassailable authority. The sun hammered down. The alkali dust of the street rose in shimmering waves, coating Jed's tongue and throat. Thirst became a living thing, a creature with claws tearing at his insides. His torn shoulder throbbed in a hot, agonizing rhythm with his own pulse, and his ribs felt like a cage of broken glass. But the physical pain was a distant shore. He was adrift in an ocean of loss, and a cold, terrible current was beginning to pull him under. He didn't fight it. He let it take him. Let the grief scour him clean. Let the hate take root in the empty spaces where laughter and loyalty used to live. Ours bled into one another. The shadow of the gallows crept across the square, a long, dark finger that eventually touched his feet, offering a sliver of shade that felt more like a curse than a comfort. He closed his eyes, and Leo's face was there grinning over a campfire, reeking of cheap whiskey, his eyes alight with some harebrained scheme. You take that money and you ride so far south the snow don't know your name. You hear me, Jed? A bitter, soundless laugh shook Jed's frame. Leo, ever the optimist, had believed in escape, in a future. But Jed saw the truth now. There was no escaping redemption. There was only the settling of its debts. It was late afternoon when they came for him. The heat had finally broken, but the air was still and heavy. Marshal Thorne returned, flanked by his two most brutish deputies, Miller and Cale. Their breath smelled of whiskey, their eyes held the lazy cruelty of men who enjoyed their power. "Well, Stone," Thorne drawled, unlocking the heavy iron cuffs from the post. The sudden freedom in his arms was a shock, and he nearly collapsed. "I figure you've had enough of our town's hospitality." Jed didn't speak. He just stared at Thorne, his eyes sunk deep into his bruised and swollen face. "The sentence was for your partner," Thorne continued, a faint smile playing on his lips. "My own judgment is that you are to be banished. You are never to set foot in Redemption again. You understand?" Jed gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Good." Thorne jerked his head at the deputies. "See that he gets on his way." Miller and Cale grabbed Jed's arms, their grips like iron bands. They didn't lead him, they dragged him. Past the silent storefronts, past the blacksmith's forge, past the edge of town where the pretense of civilization gave way to scrub and rock. They hauled him into a dry, sun-baked arroyo, the loose rock skittering under his boots. "This seems far enough," Miller grunted, shoving Jed forward. He stumbled and fell to his knees. The marshal said to see him on his way. Cale said with a vicious grin, "We ought to give him a proper send-off." The first kick caught Jed in his broken ribs, stealing the air from his lungs in a blinding flash of white-hot pain. He gasped, curling into a ball as another boot slammed into his back. They were on him then, a flurry of kicks and punches. It wasn't a fight, it was a dissection. They worked with a focused, methodical brutality, as if they were stomping out a fire. He felt the crunch of his nose, the sharp crack of another rib. He tasted blood and dust. Through the haze of pain, he heard Thorne's voice, distant and mocking. "Consider this the mercy of redemption, Stone. We're giving you a reason to never come back." He must have lost consciousness, because when the world swam back into focus, he was alone. The sky above was a deep, bruised purple, streaked with the blood orange of the dying sun. The air was cold now, and every breath was a fresh torment. He was lying in a shallow ditch, half covered in loose gravel. For the coyotes, he thought. They had left him for the coyotes. He lay there for what could have been minutes or an hour, listening to the frantic beating of his own heart. They had taken everything. His friend, his freedom, his future. They had beaten his body to a pulp. But as he lay in the dirt, something deep inside him began to stir. They thought they had broken him. They were wrong. They hadn't broken him. They had simply stripped away everything that wasn't rage. A sound nearby scrape of a boot on rock. Jed's muscles tensed. He forced his head to turn, his vision blurry. A figure stood at the edge of the ditch, silhouetted against the last light of day. An old man, bent and weary, with a beard like a tangle of roots and eyes that seemed to have seen the world burn down and be reborn a dozen times. It was Elias, a prospector who lived in a shack a few miles out, a man the townsfolk tolerated but never trusted. Elias stared down at him, his expression unreadable. He swirled the contents of a canteen, the sound of the sloshing water the most beautiful music Jed had ever heard. "Saw what they did," the old man rasped, his voice like stones grinding together. "Saw what they did this morning, too." Leo was a fool, but he wasn't a bad man. He uncorked the canteen and let a thin stream of water fall onto Jed's cracked lips. It was agony and ecstasy at once. Jed drank, the water clearing some of the fog from his brain. Elias looked him over, a clinical assessment. "You're busted up bad, but you ain't dead." He reached into a leather pouch at his belt and pulled out a piece of dried venison and a small, rusty skinning knife with a worn wooden handle. He tossed them down into the ditch beside Jed. "It ain't much, but it's more than they left you with." Jed's fingers closed around the handle of the knife. It felt solid, real, a tool. "They made a mistake," Elias said, his gaze turning back towards the distant, flickering lights of the town. "They should have finished the job." The old man turned and walked away without another word, melting back into the twilight. Left alone in the gathering dark, Jed clutched the knife. The water had given him clarity. The jerky was a promise of strength. The knife was the means. He used it to cut a strip from the bottom of his shirt, fashioning a crude bandage for his shoulder. The pain was immense, but it was a grounding force now, a reminder of the debt that was owed. With a groan that was more animal than human, he began the long, agonizing process of getting to his feet. He used the knife to dig into the side of the ditch for leverage, his muscles screaming, his vision swimming with black spots. He fell twice, but on the third try, he was standing, swaying, a broken scarecrow of a man. He looked back at redemption, a constellation of false warmth in the vast, cold dark. The sun was gone, its final red stain bleeding from the horizon. Dawn had been their time. They had used its clean, hopeful light to commit murder and call it justice. But the night was his. And so was the next day. He felt the vow form, not in his mind, but in his very marrow. It was a cold, hard certainty in a world that had been ripped apart. He brought the blade of the rusty knife to his lips, tasting his own blood on the steel. "Leo," he whispered to the wind, the name a prayer and a curse. Then, he spoke the promise aloud to the coming stars, his voice a raw, shredded thing that was barely human. "By sundown tomorrow," he vowed, his eyes fixed on the town that had wronged him, "the Noose comes back for them all." The sun reached its zenith, a merciless and blinking eye hanging directly over redemption. The heat was a physical weight, pressing down on the dusty streets and warping the air above the rooftops. Most folks were indoors, seeking refuge from the oppressive glare. The town was quiet, caught in the sleepy, midday lull. It was the perfect time for a ghost to walk. He came from the east, the same direction as the rising sun that had witnessed his friend's murder. But Jedediah Stone was no longer a creature of the light. He was a specter carved from shadow and pain, a walking corpse with a purpose. The townsfolk who saw him stopped dead in their tracks. This was not the man they had seen chained to the post. That man had been broken, filled with anguish. This man was empty of everything but a cold, hard resolve that burned in the depths of his bruised and swollen eyes. Caked in a mask of dried blood and alkali dust, he moved with a stiff, painful limp, yet there was a terrifying deliberation to his pace. He wasn't wandering, he was hunting. Whispers followed him like flies. "Is that Stone? I thought the marshal ran him off. Sweet heavens, look at him. He looks like he crawled out of his own grave." Jed ignored them. Their words were meaningless noise. His world had narrowed to a singular path, and the first stop on that path was the livery stable. The smell of hay and horse manure was thick in the air, a scent that reminded him of 1,000 nights on the trail with Leo. The memory was a fresh stab of pain, but he converted it instantly to fuel. Inside, in a patch of shade near a large water trough, Deputy Cale was leaning back in a chair, a deck of cards in his hand, idly practicing a shuffle. He was one of the two who had held Jed down in the arroyo, his grunting laughter a key note in the symphony of the beating. Cale looked up as Jed's shadow fell over him, and a slow, arrogant smirk spread across his face. "Well, look what the buzzards drug in," he drawled, not bothering to get up. "I thought Thorne told you to make yourself scarce. You got a death wish, Stone." Jed didn't answer. He just kept walking towards him, his limp seeming to grow less pronounced with each step. Cale's smirk faltered. He saw the look in Jed's eyes, then at fear, not anger, but an unnerving, absolute emptiness. He started to push himself up from his chair, his hand instinctively going for the pistol at his hip. He was too slow. In a blur of motion that seemed impossible for his battered body, Jed closed the distance. He grabbed the front of Cale's shirt, yanking him forward out of the chair. He slammed the deputy's head against the thick wooden post of a horse stall, the impact a sickening, hollow thud. Cale grunted, stunned, his eyes rolling back. Before he could recover or draw his weapon, Jed spun him around, pressing him hard against the rough-hewn planks. The rusty skinning knife from Elias was in his hand. It wasn't a weapon for a clean fight. It was a tool for a dirty job. There was no sound but a choked, wet gasp. Cale's eyes went wide with a final, shocking understanding. Jed held him there for a moment, his face inches from the deputy's, letting him feel the life draining out of him. "This is for laughing," Jed whispered, his voice a dry rasp. He let the body slump to the hay-strewn floor. He didn't even glance at it. He took the deputy's gun belt, checking the Colt Peacemaker. It was loaded. He strapped it on. It felt heavy, but right. He dragged Cale's body into an empty stall, kicked some loose hay over it, and walked back out into the blinding sun. One down. His next stop was the blacksmith's forge at the other end of the street. Henderson, the blacksmith, was a mountain of a man with arms like tree trunks and a booming laugh that could curdle milk. He had been one of the loudest jeerers that morning, his voice rising above the crowd in cruel mockery as Leo was led to the gallows. The clang of hammer on steel rang out from the forge. Jed stepped into the oppressive heat and gloom. Henderson was at the anvil, his back to the entrance, sweat glistening on his bare, muscular back. He was shaping a horseshoe, the rhythmic ringing of his work masking Jed's silent approach. Jed picked up a heavy iron rod from a scrap pile. He didn't need stealth for this one. This one was personal. "Henderson," he said. The blacksmith stopped his hammering, placing the glowing horseshoe into a bucket of water. It hissed, a plume of steam rising. He turned, wiping his brow with a greasy forearm. His eyes widened slightly when he saw Jed. "Stone. What in the hell are you?" He didn't finish. Jed swung the iron rod, a full-bodied, pain-fueled arc that connected with the side of Henderson's knee. The blacksmith roared in pain and surprise, stumbling sideways, his leg buckling. He was a big man, and a tough one. He snarled, grabbing a heavy forging hammer from the side of the anvil and lunging. The fight was brutal and primal. It was a clash of brute strength against sheer, unadulterated will. Henderson swung the hammer in wide, powerful arcs that would have crushed Jed's skull, but his injured leg made him clumsy. Jed, smaller and quicker despite his injuries, moved inside the swings, using the iron rod to block and jab. The forge was filled with the grunts of exertion, the clang of iron on iron, and the sickening thud of blows landing on flesh. Jed took a glancing blow to his bad shoulder that sent a galaxy of pain through his body, but he bit down on a scream and drove the end of the rod into Henderson's gut. The big man wheezed, doubling over. It was the opening Jed needed. He dropped the rod and surged forward, driving his shoulder into the blacksmith's chest, pushing him backward until his legs hit the base of the massive anvil. Henderson lost his balance and fell backward, his head and shoulders crashing down onto the flat, steel surface he used to shape metal. His eyes were dazed for only a second. Jed grabbed the forging hammer from his stunned grasp. He raised it high. Henderson saw it coming. The jeering arrogance was gone from his eyes, replaced by a raw, pleading terror. Jed brought the hammer down. He left the blacksmith's body slumped over the anvil he used to forge chains, a grotesque parody of his life's work. He walked out, his breathing ragged, fresh blood dripping from a cut on his cheek. To down. The town was no longer just whispering. A boy who had been watching from across the street ran screaming for his mother. Windows were being shuttered. Doors were being bolted. The quiet lull of noon had been broken. Jed moved into the alleyway between the general store and the assayer's office. He leaned against the rough brick wall, taking a moment to breathe through the pain. He could hear shouting now, the sound of running feet. They knew. He saw his third target. Deputy Miller, the other man from the Arroyo, was running down the center of the street, his gun drawn, his face a mask of confusion and alarm. He was yelling Thorne's name. Jed pulled the Colt from Cale's holster. He rested his arm on a stack of crates to steady his aim. Miller was a symbol of Thorne's law, out in the open, exposed. Jed took a breath, the image of Leo at the end of the rope flashing in his mind. He exhaled slowly and squeezed the trigger. The gunshot was deafening, a single, sharp crack that ripped through the fabric of the day. On the main street, Deputy Miller stopped short. A small, dark hole appeared in the center of his chest. He looked down at it, a comical expression of surprise on his face. He dropped his pistol, took to stumbling steps, and collapsed face first into the thick dust of the street he was sworn to protect. The scream that followed was the collective voice of the entire town. Jed didn't wait to watch the chaos unfold. He holstered the still smoking pistol and melted back into the shadows of the alley, a phantom who had fired the first shot in a war the town of Redemption didn't even know it was fighting. Panic, like a flash flood, swept through Redemption. The single gunshot had been a declaration. The sight of Deputy Miller's body lying motionless in the middle of Main Street transformed whispers of fear into screams of terror. People who had been cautiously peeking from their windows now slammed their shutters closed and bolted their doors. The town that had felt so righteous and secure at dawn had become a cage, and the monster was inside with them. Marshal Thorne burst out of his office, his face thunderous. When he saw Miller's body, his rage was momentarily eclipsed by a cold knot of disbelief. He had beaten Stone. He had exiled him. Men like that, broken and humiliated, were supposed to crawl away and die. They weren't supposed to come back. They weren't supposed to start a war in broad daylight. Get him, Thorne roared to his remaining deputies. Spread out. Check every alley, every stable, every damn outhouse. I want him found." But his men hesitated, their faces pale. They had heard the single shot. They saw Miller, one of their own, lying dead. This wasn't a drunken brawler they were hunting, it was a ghost. Jed had killed 2 of their men and a town citizen in less than an hour, all without being clearly seen. The manhunt Thorne organized was chaotic and fearful from the start. Deputies moved in pairs, their eyes scanning rooftops and dark doorways, their guns held so tightly their knuckles were white. Meanwhile, the legend was being born. The story of Jed's return spread faster than a prairie fire. It twisted and grew with each telling. Some said his eyes glowed red. Others swore the bullets they fired would pass right through him. A stable boy, who had been hiding in a loft and witnessed the silent execution of Deputy Cale, told a wide-eyed group of men that he'd heard Stone whisper a vow over the body. The words got twisted, amplified by the town's collective fear, but the sentiment remained. By the time the story reached the saloon, it had taken on the chilling weight of prophecy. By sundown, he's bringing the noose back for them all. The phrase latched onto the town's terrified heart. Sundown. A deadline. A promise of a reckoning. And the hunter was already at work. Jed knew this town. He and Leo had spent a week here before the incident, pacing the bank, learning the rhythms of the place, the patrol routes, the blind spots. Now, he used that knowledge like a scalpel. He wasn't the one being hunted. He was the one laying the trap. He led 2 deputies on a chase through the narrow network of alleys behind the shops. They thought they had him cornered. As they rounded a corner, one of them ran headlong into a length of rope Jed had tied between a rain barrel and a fence post. The deputy went down hard, and before his partner could even react, Jed dropped from the low roof of a woodshed behind him. The last thing the second deputy heard was the whisper of moving air. Jed left their bodies in the alley, a grim tableau for the next search party to find. He moved across the rooftops, a dark shape against the bright blue sky, watching the futile efforts of Thorne's men below. He was a shepherd of fear, herding them, controlling their movements, making their own town a weapon against them. He picked off another deputy with a single shot from the roof of the general store, the man falling from his horse near the very gallows where Leo had died. The message was unmistakable. The town was now in lockdown. The streets were utterly deserted. The only movement was Thorne's increasingly desperate and dwindling posse. In the opulent, second-floor suite of the Grand Saloon, Silas Croft was pouring his 3rd glass of whiskey, his hands shaking so badly that the liquor sloshed over the rim. He had heard the gunshots. He had heard the screams. He had heard the rumors, the impossible stories of Jed's return, and the terrible vow he had supposedly made. Silas was a man who lived by calculating odds, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he was at the very top of Jed's list. The money the marshal had paid him for the information felt like cursed coins in his pocket. He had hired 2 hard-looking gunslingers who now stood guard outside his door, but their presence offered little comfort. How do you guard against a ghost? He paced the room, peering nervously through the thick lace curtains at the deserted square below. He could see Marshal Thorne, his face a mask of fury, trying to rally his terrified men. It was hopeless. Thorne was fighting a conventional battle. Jed was fighting a war of terror. The sun began its slow descent in the west, and the shadows in the streets began to lengthen. Each elongated shadow looked like a man, a threat. The approaching sundown was no longer just the end of a day. It was the ticking of a clock, counting down to a final, bloody payment. The whole town of Redemption held its breath, waiting. And out in the growing darkness, Jedediah Stone was waiting, too. His hunt was far from over. As twilight began to bleed across the sky, casting long, distorted shadows that turned the town into a landscape of dread, Jedediah Stone shifted his focus. The deputies had been the muscle, the tools of Thorne's authority. Now, it was time to go for the architects of his pain. His target was the Grand Saloon, the finest building in Redemption, a monument to the greed and hypocrisy he had come to despise. And inside, on the 2nd floor, was the rat, Silas Croft. A frontal assault was not his style. The 2 hired guns Croft had watching his door would be expecting it. Jed needed a diversion, something loud and bright that would pull the town's remaining focus away from the center of town. He slipped through the back alleys to the far western edge of town, near the old, abandoned hay barn. It was a tinderbox, dried out by years of relentless sun. Using a match pilfered from one of the dead deputies, he lit a small bundle of dry straw and tossed it into the barn's dark interior. The dry wood and hay caught instantly. Within moments, angry orange flames were licking at the weathered gray planks, casting a frantic, dancing light against the darkening sky. Fire! The shout was thin at first, then picked up by others. It was the one cry that could still bring the terrified townsfolk out of their homes. A fire could consume them all. From his vantage point, Jed watched as Marshal Thorne, his face a grim mask of frustration, made a choice. He couldn't ignore a fire. He barked orders, pulling his last two deputies and a handful of armed volunteers away from the center of town, sending them running towards the growing inferno. The square, and the saloon that overlooked it, were left almost entirely deserted. The trap was set. Under the cover of the confusion's distant shouting, the ringing of a frantic church bell moved. He entered the saloon through the kitchen in the back, a place Leo had pointed out during their initial reconnaissance. The staff had fled. Empty glasses and half-eaten meals sat on the tables, a testament to the town's sudden panic. The main room was empty, echoing with a cathedral-like silence. He took the main staircase, his boots making no sound on the thick, red carpet. At the top of the stairs, he saw them. Two gunslingers, leaning against the wall on either side of Croft's suite. They were professionals, their eyes sharp, their hands never far from their holstered pistols. But they were bored, and their attention was divided, drawn to the commotion of the fire they could hear outside. Jed didn't give them a chance to get organized. He drew Cale's Colt and fired a single shot from the shadowy landing. He didn't aim for a kill. He aimed for the ornate oil lamp hanging on the wall between them. The bullet shattered the glass. And flame erupted, plunging the hallway into a chaos of fire and sudden, blinding darkness. The men shouted in surprise and pain, one of them momentarily blinded by the flash. Jed was already moving, a phantom in the smoke and flickering shadows. He lunged at the closest man, the one still blinking away the light, and drove the butt of his pistol into his temple. The man crumpled without a sound. The second gunslinger, recovering quickly, fired a wild shot into the darkness where Jed had been. The bullet splintered the wall. Jed was no longer there. He had rolled behind a large potted fern. He fired back, not at the man, but at the floorboards just in front of him. Wood splinters flew up, stinging the man's face and making him flinch. In that split second of hesitation, Jed was on him. The fight was a close, desperate, brutal affair, a flurry of blocked punches, a struggle for control of the gun. Jed was weaker, but he was fueled by a purpose that bordered on madness. He slammed the gunslinger's head repeatedly against the wall until the man went limp and slid to the floor. He kicked open the door to Silas Croft's suite. The gambler was a pathetic sight. He stood in the middle of the lavish room, a derringer in his trembling hand, his face the color of spoiled milk. The sounds of the fight outside had terrified him. "Stay back, Stone," he shrieked, his voice cracking. "I'm warning you." Jed holstered his pistol and simply walked towards him, his eyes burning with a cold fire. Croft's manufactured courage failed him. He fired the derringer. The shot was wild, smashing a mirror on the wall behind Jed. Jed didn't even flinch. He backhanded Croft across the face, a sharp, cracking blow that sent the small pistol skittering across the floor. The gambler stumbled back, tripping over an ottoman and collapsing into a heap of well-dressed terror. "Money," Croft sobbed, crawling backward. "I'll give you anything. There's a safe behind the painting. Take it all." "Your money is worthless to me," Jed said, his voice a low growl. He grabbed Croft by his expensive lapels and hauled him to his feet. The gambler whimpered, all pretense of a fight gone. "You sold my brother's life for a handful of silver. Now, you're going to be part of the payment." He dragged the weeping, pleading Silas Croft out of the room, past the unconscious bodies of his guards, and down the stairs. He pushed him out the swinging doors of the saloon and into the town square. The fire at the edge of town painted the sky in hellish strokes of red and orange. The gallows stood waiting, a skeleton in the twilight. The square was a stage, lit by the distant fire and the last vestiges of daylight. Jed's emergence from the saloon, dragging the disgraced gambler behind him, was a dramatic entrance that did not go unnoticed. Marshal Thorne, having realized the fire was a ruse to draw him away, came thundering back into the square on his horse, his last two deputies and a few frightened volunteers right behind him. They skidded to a halt, forming a loose semicircle, their guns all trained on the lone, battered figure of Jedediah Stone. "It's over, Stone." Thorne's voice was a ragged roar, stretched thin by the day's events. He was no longer the calm, collected lawman from the morning. He was a man watching his authority, his entire world, burn down around him. "Let Croft go. You've made your point." Jed just laughed. It was a terrible sound, wry and hollow, devoid of any humor. It was the sound of a man who had passed the point of no return. He shoved Croft towards the gallows, the gambler stumbling on the steps. "My point," Jed called back, his voice carrying in the tense silence. "I haven't even begun to make my point, Marshal. You just provided the props." Thorne saw Jed's intent. He saw the rope still dangling from the crossbeam. A cold dread, colder than the fear he'd felt all day, settled in his gut. This madman was going to lynch Croft right in front of him. It was a direct assault on everything Thorne represented. It could not stand. "Take him," Thorne yelled, his voice cracking. "Fire." The world exploded in gunfire. But Jed was ready. He shoved Croft to the wooden floor of the gallows and dove behind the thick timber frame of the structure itself. Bullets splintered the wood around him, whining past his head. The volunteers, raw and terrified, fired wildly. The two deputies were more measured, advancing, using the water trough and a horse cart for cover. It was a desperate, chaotic battle fought in the dying light. Jed was outgunned, but he had the superior position and a terrifying clarity of purpose. He wasn't trying to survive, he was trying to win. He fired Cale's Colt with deadly precision. He didn't waste shots. Each bullet had a purpose. One of the volunteers clutched his chest and fell. Another screamed and ran. One of the deputies, peering out from behind the water trough, took a bullet in the neck and collapsed into the muddy water with a splash. It was down to Thorne and his last man. They were pinned down and able to get a clear shot. Jed was a phantom, firing from different points around the gallows, a moving shadow in the gloom. Thorne knew he had to end it. He was a lawman. He was Marshal Thorne. He would not be beaten by a half-dead outlaw. In a moment of pure, frustrated rage, he stood up from behind his cover and charged, firing his pistol rapidly. "Stone," he roared. Jed stepped out from behind the main post. Time seemed to slow. The two men faced each other across 30 yards of blood-soaked dust. The lawman and the avenger. Their duel was intensely personal. It was a clash between the man who had murdered justice at dawn and the man who had become its brutal, vengeful specter by dusk. Both men fired. Thorne's bullet tore through the fleshy part of Jed's side, a searing, white-hot pain. Jed's bullet was truer. It struck Thorne in the shoulder, the same shoulder Jed's had been injured in. The impact spun the marshal around, and his pistol flew from his numb fingers. He staggered and fell to his knees, clutching his ruined arm, disarmed and defeated. His last deputy, seeing his leader fall, lost his nerve, threw down his gun, and ran. The gunfight was over. Silence, thick and heavy, fell over the square. Jed stood, breathing heavily, swaying on his feet, his shirt soaked with fresh blood. He looked at the wounded marshal, at the whimpering gambler on the gallows, and at the rope, swinging gently in the evening breeze. The silence was a vacuum, pulling the remaining townsfolk from their homes. They emerged cautiously, like nocturnal animals after a storm, drawn by the sudden cessation of gunfire. Their faces, illuminated by the hellish glow of the distant fire, were masks of shock and awe. They saw the scene of carnage. The bodies of the deputies and volunteers scattered across the square. Their marshal, the unassailable symbol of their town's power, kneeling in the dirt, clutching a bloody shoulder. And standing over it all, a terrifying, blood-soaked silhouette against the crimson sky, was Jedediah Stone. Beside him, Silas Croft was a weeping, incoherent mess, and beside them both stood the gallows. Jed walked over to the defeated Thorne. He kicked the marshal's discarded pistol away and hauled him to his feet. Thorne cried out in pain but didn't resist. He was a broken man. Jed shoved him towards the gallows, forcing him up the 13 steps where Leo had walked that morning. He deposited Thorne next to Croft, 2 trophies from his bloody hunt. He then turned to face the crowd. His voice was not a shout, but it was raw and carried an undeniable power that cut through the night air. "You all came out this morning to watch a man die," he began, his voice raspy and strained. "You called it justice. You cheered for it." He pointed a trembling finger at Croft. This man, Silas Croft, sold Leo's life for a bag of Thorn's silver. He set us up. There was no murder. The bank guard was killed by a stray bullet from one of your own deputies. He then gestured to the marshal. And this man, your righteous marshal, he knew it was a lie. But he needed someone to hang. He needed to show you all how strong your law was. So he took an innocent man and made a spectacle of him. A murmur went through the crowd. They looked from Jed, to the cowering Croft, to the defeated Thorn. There was no denial from either man. The truth, ugly and undeniable, settled over them. You celebrated a murder. Jed's voice dropped to a near whisper, yet it was more chilling than a scream. I'm not here to bring you justice. I'm here to bring you balance. He turned his back on them. He picked up the hangman's rope, the very same one that had ended Leo's life. With methodical, practiced motions, he fashioned a second noose. The crowd watched in horrified, mesmerized silence. This was not a celebration. This was a ritual, a grim and terrible reenactment. He placed a noose over Croft's head, then one over Thorn's. The marshal looked at him, his face a mixture of pain, humiliation, and dawning terror. Stone don't, he pleaded. Jed leaned in close, his voice for Thorn's ears alone. Did you give him a choice? The last sliver of the sun was a molten red line on the horizon. Sundown was here. Jed looked from Thorn to Croft, his face an unreadable mask of exhaustion and grief. He stepped to the heavy wooden lever that controlled the trapdoor. Any last words? He asked, the question a final, bitter echo of the morning's proceedings. Croft was sobbing too hard to speak. Thorn just stared out at the town he once commanded, his face ashen. Jed didn't wait for an answer. As the sun finally disappeared, plunging the world into twilight, he kicked the lever. The sound of the trapdoor falling was like the crack of doom, a definitive, final punctuation mark on a day of blood and vengeance. Two bodies dropped, their silhouettes swinging starkly against the deep, purple sky. The balance was paid. A silence deeper and more profound than any the town had ever known fell upon the square. It was a weighted, suffocating silence, broken only by the gentle, rhythmic creak of the gallows rope and the distant crackle of the now unattended fire. The townsfolk of Redemption stood frozen, a gallery of ghosts in the gloaming, their faces upturned. They were staring at a grotesque mirror image of the morning's spectacle, but the righteous satisfaction was gone, replaced by a cold, sickening horror. They had been shown the true face of their justice, and it was indistinguishable from raw, brutal vengeance. Jedediah Stone stood for a long moment, the smoke from his final gunshot curling from the barrel of his Colt, a thin, gray wisp that rose and vanished into the evening air. The fire that had driven him all day, the inferno of rage and grief, had been quenched. He had thought that this moment the sight of his enemies swinging from the same rope that had taken Leo would bring him a sense of victory, of peace. But it didn't. There was only a vast, aching emptiness, a hollowed-out cavern in his soul where his brother used to be. The ghosts he had sought to appease were silent, and he was alone with the dead. His gaze swept across the faces in the crowd. He saw no more jeering, no more scorn. He saw only fear, shock, and the dawning, terrible comprehension of their own complicity. They had been spectators at a feast of injustice, and now the bloody bill had been paid in full, right on their doorstep. Their town, named for salvation, had become a charnel house. Slowly, his battered body screaming in protest, he walked down the gallows steps. Each step was an agony. The bullet wound in his side was a hot, insistent fire, and his earlier injuries throbbed with the deep ache of exhaustion. He limped over to the hitching post where he had been chained that morning. The iron was cool to the touch now. He rested a hand on it, not out of sentiment, but as if to confirm that the entire, nightmarish day had been real. He took one last look at the gallows, at the two dark figures swaying against the first faint stars. His work was done. The promise he had made in the dust and ashes was fulfilled. The debt was paid. Without another glance at the people of Redemption, he turned his back on the town. He turned his back on the bodies, the blood, and the memory of Leo's final moments. He began to walk away, his shadow impossibly long in the twilight, stretching back towards the scene of his vengeance like a tether he was struggling to break. Each step took him further into the encroaching darkness of the prairie, leaving a town of silent, haunted witnesses behind him. The second dawn came to redemption not with the clean light of hope, but as a reluctant witness, timidly pulling back the curtain of night to expose the full wreckage of the day before. The morning sun illuminated a landscape of profound, deathly stillness. The bodies still lay where they had fallen. The two figures still hung from the gallows, grotesque silhouettes against a morbidly beautiful blue sky. No church bell rang. No children's laughter was heard. The town seemed to be holding its breath, trapped in the horrific aftermoment of a storm's passage. The first to emerge was the blacksmith's young apprentice, Bowie not yet 17, sent to do the grim work of cutting the ropes. He worked with trembling hands, avoiding the sight of the swollen, purpled faces of the marshal he had once feared and the gambler he had once envied. When the bodies of Thorne and Croft dropped to the earth with a heavy, final thud, the sound seemed to tear through the silence, making people flinch behind their bolted doors. Slowly, the town began to move, not with the vibrancy of a community, but like disturbed insects crawling from their shelters. They dragged their dead from the streets. They scrubbed at the bloodstains that had turned to a dark rust in the dust. Every action was performed in a hushed, furtive silence, with averted eyes. They dared not look at one another, for to do so was to acknowledge their own role in the bloody play, the eager audience of the first act, and the horrified prisoners of the last. That night, the Grand Saloon, once the town's hub of laughter and bravado, was unnervingly quiet. The men who gathered there did so not to celebrate or forget, but to try and understand. They drank their whiskey in silence, the clink of glass on with the loudest sound in the room. He was a devil, Abernathy, the portly merchant, finally said, his voice a hoarse whisper. A devil sent straight from hell to punish us. A few men nodded into their glasses, the simple explanation a comforting blanket for a truth too complex to face. But from a dark corner, a voice like stones grinding together cut through the murmur. He wasn't a devil. All eyes turned to the corner. The old prospector, Elias, sat there, a nearly empty glass in his gnarled hand. He rarely came to town, and never to the saloon. His presence commanded a sudden, wary respect. I saw him after Thorne's boys left him for dead in the Arroyo, Elias continued, his gaze distant. I saw a man, not a demon. A man broken down to his very last piece, and that last piece was loyalty to his friend. He looked around the room, his eyes lingering on each man. You didn't see a devil yesterday. You saw a mirror. You saw everything you pretended to be righteous, just, strong forged into something real and terrible. You celebrated a lie in the morning, so a man who was nothing but truth came for you in the evening. He reached into his worn leather pouch and emptied a half-dozen spent cartridge casings onto the table. They gleamed with a dull brassiness in the lamplight. These are his, Elias rasped. They are not the work of a demon. They are the work of a man with a steady hand and a broken heart. You didn't create a legend yesterday. You created a ghost. And he will haunt this town not because he's still here, but because he showed you all what you truly are. No one spoke. The weight of the old man's words filled the room, heavier than any silence that had come before. The story of Jedediah Stone was now set. It would spread, carried by travelers and traders, a cautionary tale whispered around campfires. But in redemption, it would be more than a story. It would be their history, their identity. They were the town that had been judged by a dead man's friend, the town that had mistaken justice for entertainment, and had paid for it in blood. The name Sundown Jed was now etched into the very soul of the place, a permanent scar to mark its sin. Jedediah Stone walked into the darkness, leaving the faint, hellish glow of redemption behind him. Each step was a negotiation with pain. The fresh bullet wound in his side was a hot, searing coal, and every breath sent fire through his broken ribs. The vengeful fury that had fueled him, that had turned his broken body into an unstoppable weapon, was gone. It had burned out the moment the trapdoor fell, leaving behind only the cold, gray ashes of exhaustion. He was running on nothing now. The world around him became a blur of indistinct shapes and sounds. The wind whispering through the sagebrush sounded like the accusing murmurs of the crowd. The lonely howl of a distant coyote sounded like the cry of anguish he had torn from his own throat just yesterday morning. It felt like a lifetime ago. He stumbled, catching himself on a jagged rock, the sharp pain in his hand a distant, an important sensation. His mind was strangely quiet. He didn't think of Leo's death. He didn't think of the faces of the men he had killed. He was too tired. The sheer weight of the day, of the 13 steps he had forced the men to climb, of the countless shots he had fired, had settled upon him not as guilt, but as a profound, physical weariness that went bone deep. He was a vessel that had been filled with rage and then emptied. Now he was just empty. He reached the crest of a small, rocky hill that overlooked the town. He paused, leaning against a weathered juniper tree, his breathing a ragged, painful rasp. He could see the lights of redemption scattered below, a place that now existed for him only as a monument to his pain. It was then that the shot rang out. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was a sharp, angry crack in the vast silence of the night. A young deputy named Collier, a boy who had hidden in a hayloft, paralyzed by fear during the gunfight, had finally found his courage. Or what he mistook for courage. It was shame, a desperate need to undo his cowardice, to be the hero who finally stopped the monster. He hadn't aimed carefully. He had just seen a figure on the ridge and fired, his hands trembling. The bullet struck Jed squarely in the back. There was no cry of pain, only a sharp, surprised intake of breath. It was not the agony that registered, but the impact, a stunning, final blow that his body could no longer absorb. His legs, which had carried him through a day of impossible feats, simply gave out. He slid down the trunk of the tree and collapsed to his knees in the dust. There was no anger, no surprise, only a strange, quiet sense of inevitability. He had traded his life for Leo's honor the moment he made his vow. This was just the final payment being collected. He looked down, but he couldn't see the wound. He could only feel a spreading warmth, a final draining of the strength that had seen him through. He tasted blood. His gaze was fixed on the town below. From this ridge, he had a clear view of the square. He could see the gallows, a stark, black T against the endless tapestry of stars. He thought of Leo. Not the image of him at the end of a rope, but a memory from years ago, two of them sharing a canteen by a small campfire, Leo laughing, his face illuminated by the dancing flames. Utterly and completely alive. A flicker of a smile touched Jed's lips. The debt was paid. Leo's name was not the last word in a lying lawman's report. It was the first word in a legend. His breathing grew shallow. The stars above began to blur. He did not close his eyes. He simply stopped breathing, his unseeing gaze forever locked on the town that had created him, and in the end, destroyed him. Jedediah Stone, the ghost of redemption, died alone on a cold hill, his body growing still under the vast, silent, and utterly indifferent sky. His story, a perfect and tragic circle, was complete.